You're not imagining that the world has gone mad. Healthy debate has been replaced by activist hysterics. Masculinity is condemned as regressive, while men in skirts and heels are celebrated in the public square. It's as if we're experiencing a society-wide mental breakdown. It's easy to laugh at these outbursts as the ravings of a small but vocal minority, but the compromised health of our body politic is not a trivial concern. A strange new pattern of psychological dysfunction has infiltrated our most prestigious institutions, our corporate bureaucracies, and the highest offices in the land. In short, we're sick. Our society is out of balance. We've been consumed by a cluster of disorder that appeals to our worst instincts and deranges our most important social functions. We need to recover our sanity, but to do so, we must first know exactly what we're dealing with. Every historical period develops unique psychological characteristics that shape public life. After World War I, we had the lost generation that was shell-shocked and disillusioned. In the mid-20th century, we entered the age of anxiety, characterized by a pervasive sense of existential dread in the face of the bomb. And 50 years ago, we saw the rise of the culture of narcissism, which social critic Christopher Lasch described as a society obsessed with ego, desire, and self-image. Today, we are witnessing the emergence of something new, what might be called a cluster B society. Like the culture of narcissism, our own digital age has a distinct psychological profile, heavily influenced by the power of social media. The cameras are always on. An audience is always watching. And narcissism has transformed into hysteria, moral theatrics, emotional volatility, self-indulgence, and outbursts of violence. Psychologists have captured the spirit of our modern culture in 4 specific psychopathologies that together comprise the cluster B personality disorders. Narcissistic personality disorder is characterized by a sense of entitlement, obsession with one's own self-importance, and deep feelings of resentment, often expressed through moral self-righteousness. Borderline personality disorder is characterized by an unstable sense of identity, black and white thinking, feelings of emptiness, and recurring self-harm and suicide attempts. Histrionic personality disorder is characterized by excessive emotionality, sexual provocation, and attention-seeking, often to serve a pathological need for sympathy. And antisocial personality disorder is characterized by impulsivity, manipulation, disregard for others, and a penchant for violence and aggression that violates social norms. But this cluster of social pathologies is no longer an individual matter. It has begun to shape the patterns and structures of our entire culture, which is quickly becoming a cluster B society that replaces disagreement with accusation, uses false compassion to manipulate citizens into compliance, honors victimhood instead of accomplishment, and enforces the whole scheme with the threat of violence. For most of our history, significant personality disorders were treated as problems and largely relegated to the fringes of society. But in our emerging cluster B society, the narcissist, the borderline, the hysteric, and the antisocial psychological types have been elevated into positions of power and celebrated by our institutions. The new status quo is an emerging leadership class that rules through emotional blackmail. Powerful institutions use the cover of various victim groups to impose their agenda on the rest of us. If we dissent, we're branded as hateful bigots. We're accused of lacking empathy. We're ritualistically banished. While these strategies are contemptible, they're also remarkably effective in controlling what we think, what we say, and how we act. And they've slowly transformed our institutions into what psychologist Andrei Lobachevsky calls pathocracy, or rule by psychological dysfunction. This has become our new social order. If you look around, you'll start seeing it everywhere. The cluster B traits have been formalized and entrenched in our human resource departments, government policies, cultural institutions, and civil rights law. This is a recruiting video from the CIA that overtly valorizes the cluster B traits of narcissistic identity obsession, self-righteousness, and need for affirmation.
I am a cisgender millennial who's been diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder.
In a cluster B society, psychological disorders become markers of distinction rather than problems to be solved. Politics, too, has been infected.
Belong here. We need trans people. We love trans people. Trans people belong here.
This is a state senator engaged in deranged moral theatrics, with all of the attention-seeking, black and white thinking, and excessive emotionality associated with Cluster B.
So I want to recognize that your line of questioning is transphobic, and it opens up trans people to violence by not recognizing them.
And finally, we see Kiara Bridges, a law professor at UC Berkeley, who demonstrates the kind of antagonism, emotional manipulation, and accusatory tone that has become a staple of political discourse. The goal is not to arrive at answers, but to browbeat opponents and make them feel bad for denying left-wing orthodoxy. The modern university is the primary laboratory for the Cluster B pathologies. On campus, the pathocracy rules. The social critic Heather McDonald reveals the basic contours of this regime in an essay entitled The Great Feminization of the University. McDonald argues that the dramatic rise in the number of female college administrators who now dominate the campus culture has led to a growing obsession with safety, harm, and victimization. Rather than prioritize academic achievement and substantive debate, administrators have elevated nebulous therapeutic concepts such as trauma, white fragility, and systemic injustice. As McDonald notes, when students claim to be felled by ideas that they disagree with, the feminized bureaucracy does not tell them to grow up and get a grip, it validates their self-pity. As a result, American college students have found themselves in the midst of an unprecedented mental health crisis. According to the University of Michigan's Healthy Mind study, more than 60% of college students meet the criteria for at least one mental health problem, a nearly 50% increase since 2013. The more we indulge Cluster B-style pathologies, the more we replicate them in our institutions. But rather than reverse course, university administrators have only leaned further into this broken model. Students are told that they are always under attack, that their safety is always threatened. And rather than strengthen them for meeting these challenges, administrators fight to sanitize the campus environment and shut down any speech deemed harmful or offensive. This is the perfect recipe for enabling and encouraging Cluster B-style narcissism and hysteria. Scenes and sentiments like these have become ubiquitous, and they work.
I'm uncomfortable because this event is tearing at the fabric of this community that I care about.
As we saw recently at Stanford Law School, the Dean of Diversity and Inclusion, working in a codependent manner with hyperventilating students, disrupted the speech of a federal judge. The dean accused the judge of causing harm and making her uncomfortable. This is all it takes to justify the mob. It's Cluster B-powered pathocracy in action. The Cluster B pathologies have a remarkable power of transmission, and like a pathogen leaking from a lab, they've broken containment and are spreading through the rest of society. The messaging of our major corporations is looking more and more like the celebration of disorder, whether it's attempting to normalize gender dysphoria or rewriting the standards of health and beauty. Social media has only accelerated these trends. Sites like TikTok have become a breeding ground for mental illness, especially in teenage girls, who mimic the Cluster B behaviors they see online and have seen skyrocketing rates of anxiety and depression in the real world too. The sudden explosion of transgenderism follows the same line of development. Transgender individuals are 30 times more likely to suffer from the Cluster B personality disorders compared to the general population. And more than 50% of mothers with gender dysphoric boys suffer from borderline personality disorder, a remarkable transmission of psychopathology. Much of the recent left-wing violence has also taken on the cast of the Cluster B disorders. The George Floyd riots were remarkable in part for their psychological tone. Wild emotional displays, narcissistic identity rituals, and victimology manifested in the streets. The antisocial personalities have learned how to wield left-wing ideology in order to justify their violence and terror. As psychologists have long known, there is a long-established link between violent personalities and left-wing authoritarianism. The mugshots of Antifa foot soldiers drive home the point. These are not mentally well people. They are the hideous face of antisocial violence, the enforcement arm of the modern left, the political vanguard of our Cluster B society, and they will not stop until they've transformed the world in their own image. Anonymous right-wing critics have taken to calling this strange new Cluster B regime the Longhouse, a matriarchal form of society that privileges the values of care, concern, and feminine social strategies. In an essay for the magazine First Things, the pseudonymous writer Lomez explains that women now outnumber men in professional managerial roles and vastly outnumber men in human resource departments, which have outsized influence on professional and cultural norms. The left, too, is now acknowledging the emergence of the Longhouse. In her presidential campaign, Hillary Clinton confidently declared that the future is female. And in an essay for The Atlantic, Hannah Rosen heralded this change with an essay titled The End of Men. Both were correct, but while some are celebrating this shift, our female future is not an unalloyed good. Despite what we're told, biological sex differences are real, and an imbalance between the two has negative effects for everyone. Taken too far, overly feminized leadership produces exactly the kind of cluster B society we're living in today. One in which identity is rewarded over merit, in which victimhood is prioritized over competence, in which antisocial behavior goes unchecked, in which moral narcissism is the currency of the realm. The cluster B society is upon us, and we must find a way out. We must find a way to restore balance, to restore order, to restore sanity, because if we don't, we are resigned to a world gone mad. If you want a picture of that future, imagine this person screaming in your face forever.